We can bring you some breaking news right now. Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe's first post-independence leader, has died.
He was called a dictator, a tyrant, a destroyer of the Zimbabwean economy. But who was Robert Mugabe, really? To the West, he was a villain. But to millions of Africans, Mugabe was a liberator, a visionary, and one of the few post-independence leaders who refused to sell Africa back to her former masters.
Is the persistence of vestigial attitudes from the Rhodesian yesteryears.
This is the story you weren't told, the real story about revolution, betrayal, and the war over African land, sovereignty, and memory. This is the truth about Mugabe. Let's begin where most Western media stories don't, with colonialism. Zimbabwe, then called Southern Rhodesia, was colonized by British settlers in the late 1800s, led by none other than Cecil Rhodes himself. By the early 20th century, white settlers had seized over 80% of the country's arable land, forcing the black majority into overcrowded native reserves. The system was explicitly racist. Black people couldn't vote, couldn't own prime land, and were used as cheap labor to build a white settler economy. The land wasn't just stolen, it was militarily conquered and defended by apartheid-style laws. Fast forward to the 1960s and 70s. Black nationalists began fighting back, and one of the leading voices was a young school teacher turned freedom fighter named Robert Mugabe. Mugabe was highly educated, holding 7 academic degrees, including one in law. He was well-read, disciplined, and deeply committed to Pan-Africanism. When he joined the liberation struggle, he didn't just pick up a gun, he picked up an idea.
Let no one who is negative want to spoil what we are doing for ourselves in order to unite Africa. We belong to this continent. We don't mind having and bearing sanctions banning us from Europe. We are not Europeans. We have not asked for any inch of Europe, or any square inch of that territory. So, Blair, keep your England and let me keep my Zimbabwe.
That Africans had the right to govern their own land, live with dignity, and reclaim what was stolen. The Liberation War, known as the Second Chimurenga, lasted over a decade, claiming tens of thousands of lives. It ended in 1980 with the Lancaster House Agreement, brokered by Britain. Mugabe won the country's first democratic election and became Prime Minister of newly independent Zimbabwe. But there was a catch. The Lancaster House Agreement included a clause that protected white settlers' land ownership for 10 years. Britain promised to fund land reform, willing seller, willing buyer, but insisted that Mugabe not touch white-owned farms until 1990. And Mugabe, seeking peace and stability, agreed.
Either they opt for peace or they opt to abandon peace and move into a war situation.
For the next decade, he tried the peaceful route. He maintained a mixed economy, welcomed white farmers, and respected private property. He built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure that made Zimbabwe one of the most literate and developed countries in Africa. In fact, for years, the West praised Mugabe, but they didn't expect what would come next. By the mid-1990s, it became clear that land reform was not working. The British government, under Prime Minister Tony Blair, reneged on their promises to fund land redistribution. Millions of Zimbabweans were still landless. Farms remained in the hands of fewer than 5,000 white families, while millions of black people toiled in poverty on overcrowded plots. The anger was growing. The veterans of the Liberation War demanded justice, and Mugabe had a choice: protect colonial property rights or fulfill the revolution. He chose the revolution. In 2000, Mugabe launched the fast-track land reform program. White-owned farms were seized, often forcefully, and redistributed to over 300,000 black Zimbabwean families. For the first time in history, Zimbabwe's land was African-owned, but the response was swift. The West, outraged by the loss of settler property, accused Mugabe of human rights abuses and misrule. They imposed devastating economic sanctions under the guise of targeted measures. Aid was withdrawn, loans were frozen, Zimbabwe was cut off from international markets. And just like that, the economy crashed. Not because of land reform itself, but because the country was choked into submission.
Then, of course, you can be undermined very easily and undermined by external forces.
Let's be clear. No African country has ever been punished so severely for taking back its land. Not for coups, not for election fraud, not even for genocide, only for touching white-owned land. This wasn't about democracy, it was about protecting white capital, even after independence. And Mugabe knew it. He told the UN, quote, "We are not Europeans, we are Africans. We want our land, and we will not apologize for it." This was Mugabe's real crime, defending black sovereignty against white entitlement. Now let's talk economics. Yes, Zimbabwe's economy suffered. Inflation soared, basic goods became scarce, unemployment rose. But what Western media won't tell you is why. They blame Mugabe, but ignore the impact of sanctions, currency sabotage, and the mass withdrawal of Western capital. They also ignore the fact that many of the seized farms had been operating at a loss for years, relying on subsidies and export loopholes. And while the transition to black farming was uneven and poorly supported, it wasn't the disaster the headlines claimed. By 2010, new black farmers were producing maize, tobacco, and other staples again, often without access to loans, machinery, or training. Imagine what they could have done with full state support and international recognition. But Mugabe's enemies weren't just external. Inside Zimbabwe, a new elite class began to rise. People who used land reform to enrich themselves. In his 90s, Mugabe remained sharp, but surrounded by rivals. In 2017, the military launched a coup, calling it a soft transition. They placed Mugabe under house arrest, and within days, his 37-year leadership was over. Many in the West celebrated, but on the streets of Zimbabwe and across much of Africa, a different feeling remained, a feeling of betrayal. Because for all his faults, Mugabe represented something no other African leader dared to stand for at that level. He overstayed his time. He allowed internal corruption to grow. He cracked down on opposition during difficult periods. But perfection was never the standard applied to his enemies. Mugabe was a flawed revolutionary, but he was still a revolutionary. He gave his people land, education, and a sense of self-worth in a world designed to keep them on their knees. And that cannot be erased. So what do you think? Was Mugabe a monster or a martyr, a tyrant or a titan, a dictator or a defender of African freedom? Drop your thoughts in the comments, like, share, and subscribe.